What if Hannibal crushed Rome? Picture the smoke of campfires curling over the Tiber, war elephants stamping at the edge of the Seven Hills, and the city that would one day rule the known world cowering behind its walls. Imagine the Republic, its proud senators, its stubborn legions, snuffed out not by centuries of slow decline, but in one decisive, shattering blow. If Hannibal had broken Rome, the future would not simply be different, it would be unrecognizable. Before we rewrite the map, let's ground ourselves in what really happened. In 218 BCE, Hannibal Barca crossed the Alps with a multinational army, Libyans, Iberians, Gauls, and those famous elephants, an audacious invasion of Italy itself. He won, and won spectacularly. At the Trebia River, he lured Roman forces into icy waters and crushed them. At Lake Trasimene, he sprang one of the largest ambushes in ancient history. Then came Cannae in 216 BCE, the textbook double envelopment, a slaughter so complete it haunted Roman memory forever. And yet, despite these victories, Rome refused to die. The city did not open its gates. Its allies, though shaken, did not abandon it en masse. Carthage didn't send Hannibal the heavy siege equipment he needed, and in the end, Rome adapted. The Fabian strategy wore Hannibal down, while Scipio Africanus targeted Carthaginian power bases abroad. The war pivoted to North Africa. At Zama, Hannibal lost. Rome rose. So here's the fork in the road. What if that chain snaps? What if, after Cannae, the floor falls out from under Roman power? Picture a different Carthage, decisive and generous with reinforcements. The Senate of Carthage, once stingy and cautious, now throws its weight behind a lightning finish. Massive siege trains built in Sicily roll north with Syracusan engineers. Think Archimedes' successors bringing their terrifying devices, giant catapults, movable towers, lenses, and mirrors rumored to set ships ablaze.
The intricacies of this ancient
Meanwhile,
spell
Philip V of Macedon, sensing a mortal enemy on its knees, commits real forces, not just promises. Southern Italian cities, terrified of Roman reprisals and seduced by Hannibal's charisma, defect in a wave. Capua, Tarentum, maybe even Neapolis, throwing open harbors and granaries to feed the invader. Hannibal moves on Romania, the Roman world, as a chess master closing in for mate. He doesn't just circle Rome, he starves it. He seizes Ostia, Rome's lifeline at the mouth of the Tiber. Grain from Sicily, choked. Food from Etruria, interdicted by allied cavalry. Roman roads, usually the pride of the Republic, become avenues of fear. Within the walls, the Senate fractures. Optimates scream to negotiate. Populares mutter about dictatorship. The plebs line up for dwindling bread. A city built on iron discipline begins to creak. Then the blow lands. Under cover of night and fog, Carthaginian sappers undermine a section of the Servian wall, while towers creep forward and a gate is forced from within by defectors. The elephants surge through, not many, but enough to break the spell of invincibility. Street fighting turns alleys into charnel houses. A fire ignites on the Capitoline. Somewhere in the chaos, a lictor's fasces splinters, a symbol of authority fractured. Dawn rises not on a victorious republic, but on a conquered one. The Senate is dissolved, the civic cults humbled, the eagle standard seized and paraded. If Hannibal crushes Rome, what happens next? In the immediate aftermath, Italy is rearranged like pieces on a merchant's counter. Rome's Latin alliance, the system that bound Italy to the Republic, implodes. Hannibal doesn't annex everything directly. He's too shrewd. Instead, he forges a Punic-centered coalition. Etruscan cities gain autonomy. Samnites settle old scores. Greek cities in the south become privileged ports under Carthaginian protection. A puppet regime in the shell of Rome administers the Tiber region, stripped of its colonies and its pride. Hostages are taken, treaties signed, and tribute instituted. Carthage becomes the arbiter of the Western Mediterranean. And the sea? The sea becomes Carthage's highway. Hispania, rich in silver and manpower, is locked down as the empire's beating heart. Sicily and Sardinia, no longer Roman stepping stones, are Punic fortresses, lighthouses of a maritime empire. Gaul's southern coast blooms with trade depots. The Western Med becomes a chain of pearls strung on Carthaginian shipping lanes. Rome's talent for road building is replaced by Carthage's genius for harbors, warehouses, and contract law. Instead of a land empire of legions, the West is knit by sales, tariffs, and treaties. But what about the East? Macedon, smelling opportunity, reasserts itself in Greece, dealing with the Aetolian and Achaean leagues from a position of strength. The Seleucids and Ptolemies, those heirs of Alexander forever wrestling over Coele Syria, face a new reality, a Carthaginian partner to balance against or bargain with. Carthage, pragmatic, leans into a Hellenistic Punic synthesis. Greek remains the scholarly language of the Eastern Mediterranean. Punic rises in the West, alongside local tongues. In workshops from Syracuse to Carthage to Gades, artisans scrawl in a mosaic of scripts, Greek, Punic, Etruscan remnants, while a creole of trade phrases binds sailors and merchants across the sea. Now pause and listen for the echo. Without a Roman recovery, there is no later Roman Empire, no Caesar marching into Gaul, no Augustan settlement, no Pax Romana stretching for centuries. What does that erase, and what does it create? The Roman legal tradition, so foundational for later Europe, never stands at the center. Instead, Phoenician Punic commercial law, refined and standardized under Hannibal's successors, becomes the model. Contracts, maritime insurance, bottomry loans, these are the building blocks of a different Western order, one that treats cities as hubs and networks, not provinces and forts. Infrastructure follows culture. Without the imperial mania for roads and aqueducts, the West's veins are watery, not stony. Rivers and coasts do the heavy lifting. Inland Europe remains a patchwork of tribal federations, hill forts, and market towns strung along navigable currents. Gaul does not become Roman Gallia. It remains Celtic at heart, with Punic coinage in its markets and Greek tutors in its noble houses. Britain, never invaded by a Caesar, stays beyond the hazy horizon, a place of tin and legend visited by daring traders, not marching camps. Can you feel the map reshaping under your feet? And literature, what lives, what dies? No Virgil, no Aeneid to give Rome its mythic destiny. No Livy to canonize Roman courage. No Cicero to sculpt Latin prose. Latin itself, it withers in place, a provincial tongue without an empire to carry it. Instead of Romance languages blossoming from Latin roots, Western Europe speaks a braided forest of Celtic dialects, Iberian survivals, and Punic-influenced port slang. Greek remains the language of high learning and science, while Punic becomes the lingua franca of trade, notes scribbled on wax tablets, warehouse ledgers, and letters passed hand to hand across the sea. Religion? Here the divergence becomes seismic. In our timeline, Christianity spread along Roman roads and Roman cities, eventually embraced, then enforced by emperors. But without Rome's imperial spine and without Constantine's conversion, the faith's path veers. Christianity still emerges in the 1st century in Judea. Those spiritual earthquakes don't vanish, but its spread leans eastern into an Alexandrian and Antiochene orbit, where Greek is Scripture's language and debate its daily bread. In the West, the faith moves slower, filtering through ports and colonies rather than marching legions. There is no Latin church headquartered in a once Roman city, no pope inheriting the prestige of an empire. Without a Latin liturgy, the Great Schism never takes the same shape. Instead, picture a Mediterranean Christianity that is maritime, Greek in intellect, Punic in networks, and astonishingly urban. Monasteries sprout along coasts and river mouths, hubs of learning that copy Homer and Euclid as readily as sacred texts. Judaism's fate also shifts. Without Roman procurators and without Titus's siege in 70 CE, the temple's story lengthens. Judea remains a tug-of-war between Hellenistic powers, but the catastrophic destruction that defined diaspora identity takes a different form, later or softer. The debates between Pharisees, Sadducees, and early Christians play out under different rulers, different taxes, different pressures. The center of gravity may drift earlier to Alexandria's Jewish community, where Greek-speaking scholars weave faith and philosophy in ways that ripple through centuries. And centuries later, when Islam rises in Arabia, what world does it meet? Not a Roman Byzantine Empire guarding Anatolia and the Levant, but a Hellenistic patchwork, with Carthaginian-led coalitions controlling the Western Med. The early caliphates still surge across the sands, but their western front faces Punic fleets and Punic ports. North Africa, with its Phoenician heritage, could become a bridge rather than a frontier, absorbing and transforming the new faith more gradually. Al-Andalus, if it forms at all, forms along different channels, perhaps settled by sailors and scholars traveling well-worn Punic sea roads, not by armies marching over Visigothic highways that never existed. Commerce shapes curiosity. Carthage's deep merchant culture might invest earlier and more systematically in navigation. Hanno's legendary voyage along Africa's Atlantic coast becomes a beginning, not a curiosity. Over centuries, Punic mariners build a lattice of way stations, Canary archipelagos, Madeira forests, Azorian reefs, plotting wind and current with a spreadsheet's precision, not a poet's guess. With no Roman choke on innovation, sailing rigs evolved for ocean swells. By the first millennium of our era, a Carthaginian or Carthaginian-descended city-state could stand on the cusp of an Atlantic leap. Imagine a Mediterranean-born age of sail centuries ahead of schedule, driven not by kings craving empire, but by guilds seeking markets. Would their caravels find a western shore? Would the first letters sent across the Atlantic be written in Greek, cursive, over Punic numbers? Military culture also diverges. Without the legion's dominance, the phalanx, allied cavalry, and mercenary flexibility remain the gold standard. Greek-style siegecraft stays cutting edge. The idea of citizen soldiers forging identity in a standardized army, the Roman idea, never imprints West European politics. Instead, wealthy city elites hire and coordinate, while rural tribes contribute auxiliaries when profitable. Societies align less around a uniform code of martial citizenship and more around contracts, charters, and negotiated obligations. Is that more fragile? Maybe. But it's also resilient in a different way, scattering risk across networks rather than concentrating it in capitals. Law schools, too, evolve under a different star. No Justinian to codify Roman law. Instead, Carthage and its heirs assemble compendia of maritime statutes, guild regulations, and commercial precedent. University ancestors grow up in ports, Rhodes, Massalia, Carthage itself. Students sail to class. Professors argue liability for lost cargo instead of the finer points of imperial edicts. The Western legal tradition becomes experimental and transactional, a laboratory where market practice writes doctrine. Here's where I want your take. If Hannibal had stood at Rome's gates, do you think the Republic would have fractured or rallied into something even more ruthless? Tell me in the comments. And if rewiring history like this keeps your mind lit, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the next world we redraw. Let's talk about Europe's forests and frontiers. In our world, Roman conquest pushed Latin deep into Gaul and pulled Celtic elites into a Roman orbit. Without that pull, Gallic confederations endure, some edging towards statehood via trade charters and marriage alliances with Greek and Punic houses. When pressures build in Central Europe, climate shifts, population surges, the Germanic migrations don't crash into a Roman wall. They trickle and braid into a landscape of markets and city leagues. Instead of the empire falling to so-called barbarians, you get generations of negotiated settlement, hired swords in one decade, trade partners the next. The idea of a single Western empire waiting for a Charlemagne never materializes. There's no old Roman mantle to seize. Power stays plural. Art and architecture? Replace basilicas and amphitheaters with colonnaded harbors, lighthouse-topped promontories, and walled dockyards. Civic pride expresses itself not in forums, but in arsenals, granaries, and guild halls, etched with carved dolphins and date palms. Public spectacles happen on water, regattas, floating lantern festivals, diplomas awarded on the decks of merchant ships. If you're picturing Venice sprinkled across the Mediterranean centuries early, you're close. Could this world go dark? Without Roman roads and a centralized power, does knowledge dim? Not necessarily. Hellenistic science remains robust in Alexandria and Rhodes, and Punic pragmatism funds instruments, maps, and lighthouses. The university might look different, more a lattice of academies than a single cathedral school, but the lights stay on. And because no single empire declares any one doctrine universal, intellectual diversity could be wider. Fewer persecutions driven by imperial uniformity, more local eccentricities, more experiments. But history is not a straight line of Punic triumph. Carthage itself must change to hold this system. Hannibal, the architect of victory, likely becomes a reformer. He breaks oligarchic monopolies that strangled Carthaginian war effort, broadening citizenship, taxing fairly, professionalizing the navy. In doing so, he creates enemies at home, because that's what reformers do. His heirs face recurring trials, inflation from silver flows, revolts from mercenaries who want pay and rights, jealous allies who dream of replacing the center. The very flexibility that keeps the network alive also makes it prone to schisms. One century sees Carthage guiding, the next, a league centered on Massalia or Syracuse taking the lead, all while Punic law and custom underpin the system like a keel beneath churning waves. By late antiquity, imagine an Earth where the concept of Europe is less a landmass defined by Rome's shadow and more a maritime culture bound by two mother tongues, Greek in the libraries, Punic on the docks. Inland kingdoms rise, Celtic, Germanic, maybe Slavic confederations, but they court harbors rather than crowns. Missionaries preach not from hilltop basilicas, but from quayside chapels, their gospel echoing in the creak of rigging and the slap of waves. Centuries later, when gunpowder and compass marry in earnest, the old Punic instinct to push horizons could detonate. A western voyage might depart from a reimagined Cadiz under the sponsorship of a multi-city guild, not a Spanish monarch. The ships carry not imperial banners but contracts. The first meetings with the Americas, if they occur earlier or later, might be negotiated by syndicates, stamped by port seals, and recorded in bilingual ledgers. Colonies would look less like transplanted empires and more like franchise ports, with all the moral ambiguity that implies. Conversion, too, would be different. Less crown-backed mission, more dockside preaching, more syncretism. Would that produce fewer conquests, or just different ones? The question bites. And somewhere in the residue of memory, the ruins of Rome linger. Perhaps the city rebuilds as a client, a sacred site whose very defeat becomes a cautionary tale, recited by schoolboys in Punic and Greek. The legend of a proud people who refused to bend until they snapped would be told and retold, fueling theater, tragedy, even reform. Rome would still matter, but as a moral gravity, not an imperial core. Listen closely, and you can hear the meaning of it all. History is fragile. One city's refusal to open its gates, one senate's decision to fund or starve a general, one river port held or lost. Each can redirect the course of continents. If Hannibal had crushed Rome, we might inherit a world knitted by sails instead of roads, by contracts instead of codes, by harbors instead of capitals. Different languages in our mouths, different saints in our calendars, different stories in our heads. That's the thrill of what if. Not to erase our past, but to understand how many paths were possible. Cannae did not decide the world, people did. And in a different dawn over the Tiber, the elephants might have trumpeted a future where the West spoke Punic in the marketplace and Greek in the academy, and where the idea of empire never outshouted the whisper of the sea. So we leave Hannibal on the Capitoline, ash in the air and history holding its breath. Change one decision, one convoy, one gate, and the map redraws itself. That's how close everything we know came to being something else entirely.